Awesome.
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Catherine Wright. I'm a park ranger for San Mateo County Parks, and I'm happy to welcome you to our webinar, The Wonderful World of Woodpeckers. And this webinar is presented by Alvaro of Alvaro's Adventures, and it's sponsored by Sequoia Audubon Society, Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space, and San Mateo County Parks. And this morning, we're going to learn about the woodpeckers of San Mateo County and the exciting lives they lead and where you can find them. So before we get started, I'd like to say a short land acknowledgement statement. San Mateo County Parks acknowledges that our lands are located on the ancestral homeland of the Ohlone peoples, and that as the original stewards of this land, the Ohlone understood the interconnectedness of all things and maintained harmony with nature for millennia. Indigenous communities have lived in and moved through this place over hundreds of generations, and Indigenous peoples from many nations live and work in this region today. Please join us in acknowledging and honoring their ancestors, their elders, and their communities. Before we get to the main presentation, I'd like to go over some quick information about the format of this webinar. As an attendee, we cannot see your video or hear you, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature on the bottom, and we'll go over the questions towards the end of the presentation. We will be recording this session, and so we will be posting this on YouTube after the presentation. All right, I will now pass this conversation over to Jennifer Ryzenke of the Sequoia Audubon Society to introduce our presenter this morning.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thanks to all of the organizations for helping to make this a success. I am the current board chair of Sequoia Audubon Society. We have been the San Mateo County chapter of the National Audubon Society since 1949. We have helped to protect lands, including Coyote Point and Pescadero Marsh in our county. We sponsor field trips, at least when there's not a pandemic going on. We maintain an online site guide that lists over 100 locations in San Mateo County and what birds you can expect to see there. We have sponsored 2 of the most species-rich Christmas bird counts in the country. We have monthly meetings with excellent speakers and an active conservation committee that could use some more members that helps to monitor local development issues and protect land. We have distinguished ourselves as a leader in community science projects between eBird, iNaturalist, BioBlitzes, bird monitoring projects, and our cavity nester program that helps to maintain boxes for bluebirds, kestrels, barn owls, and more. Next week's general meeting, in fact, next Thursday, will feature Catherine Wright, whom you just heard. She will be speaking about San Mateo's African-American environmental pioneer, the great Sam McDonald, for whom one of our county parks is named. What led to this particular presentation on woodpeckers is a confluence of big birding events here in early 2021. The American Birding Association, which was founded in 1969, is the national organization for birds and those who watch them lovingly, birders. It has a series of publications. It maintains the definitive lists that birders use to record their sightings. And it's also the lobbying group for birds and birders. In the early 2010s, under the current president of that organization, Jeff Gordon, the ABA started a successful Bird of the Year program where you would focus on one particular species for a year. And they were usually species that had something distinctive about them. Well, this year's Bird of the Year, the reigning monarch, is the Pileated Woodpecker, a bird that is resident but uncommon in San Mateo County. So we wanted to find some way to feature that bird as part of another event, which is the Great Backyard Bird Count. The Great Backyard Bird Count is an annual event sponsored by Audubon and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is meant for both beginning birders and experienced birders to monitor bird life at the end of the winter season to kind of see who's survived. This year, a lot of people have discovered the joys of birding because of having to quarantine. And so we were hoping to really reach out to some beginners, and the woodpeckers as a family seemed perfect. They can be detected by birders of all skill, and they can be detected both visually and audibly. They're distinctive and impressive, which leads us to today's speaker, who can make all birds attractive and distinctive. And that is Alvaro Jaramillo, who is Sequoia Audubon's consulting biologist. He also runs Alvaro's Adventures, which is a tour company that leads both international tours and is famous for having brought offshore pelagic birding, when you bird from a boat, back to San Mateo County in Half Moon Bay. He also works with San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory. His ornithological range is evident in his publications, spanning the birds of California, the birds of Chile, and the definitive guide to the New World blackbirds, the icterids. But that's all the official things he does. In addition to all of that, he's just one of the good guys. He's erudite. He's always questioning and questing after more data and more experience. He's considerate, good dad, helpful to beginners and specialists alike. And he's one of the treasures of San Mateo County. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you the esteemed, but also my friend, Alvaro Jaramillo.
Wow. Well, thank you. I think I'm blushing at this point in time. Hey, thanks everybody. We have a nice group of people here watching and wanting to learn about woodpeckers. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and show you some pictures. Hopefully, if you have questions, you can type those down at the bottom in the Q&A, and we'll get to them later on. I'm going to talk maybe about half an hour or so, and then Karine we're going to switch over, and she's going to tell you more about habitat and midpen and the work they're doing, as well as where the woodpeckers are in their land. So this is really a talk where we came together as various organizations that we all have the same common goal. Apart from conserving land and birds, it's getting people out into the nature. And this is really important for your health and your mental health, and especially this year or last year and this year. Make sure you just go out and hike, and if you need something to look for, something to get you out there, why not woodpeckers, huh? Why not woodpeckers? This is an acorn woodpecker, and I'll talk about acorn woodpeckers a little later. If you sort of see in there, there's actually acorns this woodpecker has stored in these holes, like one of them's poking out over there. So it's a kind of interesting thing they do. Well, Jennifer gave you an introduction. I didn't, I thought maybe I had to introduce myself here a little bit, and I just wanted to let you know that I live in California. I was born in Chile. I grew up in Canada, and I became a birder at an early age, and also then decided to become a biologist. And eventually, I turned that interest of natural history and biology into a tour company, into touring and writing about birds. So I did write this American Birding Association guide to the birds of California, which is a good book for a beginner, as it has photographs and tells you a little bit about where to find these birds and so forth. And again, why woodpeckers? Jennifer let us know that the American Birding Association made this year's Bird of the Year, and it's a highly secretive process with all of these people in a back room somewhere that choose the annual Bird of the Year. I'm joking, of course. It's done for various different reasons. Often is to highlight species. They're often species that are found throughout the U.S. and Canada, so that nobody feels left out too much. And they're also species that tend to be showy, interesting, and tell you a story. And one of the stories that woodpeckers, and in particular the pileated or pileated woodpecker, tells you is the relationship to habitat. And I'll tell you about this a little bit later. But of course, the classic woodpecker is a bird sitting on a tree, pecking for food or making a nest in a tree. And so bark, trees, forest immediately are correlated to woodpeckers. So it's such a clear situation there of habitat and bird. Couple of things. the woodpecker's name is highly controversial in the bird world, how you pronounce it. Is it pileated or is it pileated? And you know, all the finest scholars in the world haven't figured this question out yet. And for the most part, you can pronounce it either way and nobody is going to say anything unless they're of the other camp. Then they'll correct you. The nape, the back of the head, is in Latin the pileum, and that's because it has a crest. It's the pileated woodpecker, basically has a long pileum, and I guess some people would say it's the pileum. We'd have to get a Latin scholar to sort that out for us, but we'll just call it pileated or pileated and move on. So woodpecker is a bird, so it's a feathered creature, and as some of you know, these are the descendants of the dinosaurs, and for some scientists, they actually are dinosaurs. They're just feathered flying dinosaurs. We know them as birds, and woodpeckers are well known throughout the world because they're so obvious in what they do. You know, they grip onto trunk of a tree, and then they make a hole and get food. Usually these are beetles. They're wood-boring beetles. That's one of the most common foods they get. And they will also make a hole to make a nest. And we'll talk about that a little later. So these are the holes of a pileated woodpecker. And if you go out in the forest and you see them, they're really distinctive because they're not round, they're square, and they're really deep. You see that? So if you see big square holes in the forest and going deep, that's a pileated woodpecker. And they're making these holes because they hear a creature underneath there, and then they tap, tap, tap to make that hole, and then bring the food out. And this is what the woodpecker looks like. It's our largest woodpecker here in this part of North America. And in fact, other than the extinct ivory-billed woodpecker, it is the largest woodpecker in North America. And it has a black body with all this wonderful black and white on the face, and also red on the head that varies depending on if it's a male or a female. Let's see. The woodpeckers are related to a certain set of birds that includes the kingfisher. So if you know a belted kingfisher, this one out here, it's not a close relative, but it's in the group of birds that woodpeckers belong to. If you expand a little further out to the rest of the world, toucans are in that same group of birds. And then this is a bird that maybe most of you have never heard of, but it's kind of a cool one. It's called a honey guide, and honey guides are birds related to kingfishers, toucans, and woodpeckers that can actually digest beeswax. So they fly around looking for bee nests and will eat the wax. And I guess if there's honey involved there too, they'll be munching on that as well. But it's usually the beeswax that they're looking for. And they have learned in Africa that people know where bees are, and the people want the honey, the birds want the wax. The birds will actually tell people by flying around in front of them where the bees are, and they'll go take the people there, and the folks then open up the tree where the bee's nest is. They leave some wax for the honey guide, and then the people extract the honey. It's an actual amazing relationship between birds and people that most people don't know about. And if you go back in the woodpecker world, one of the most sort of ancient woodpeckers is this one that's being held here. This is in a banding station where they put little rings on birds' legs in Israel, and it's called a Rynek. The Rynek, interesting. Well, a little side story. When my son was born, he had his neck had a little what they call torticollis. His neck was a little wonky, and the doctor said, yeah, he's got torticollis, there's no problem. We do a little therapy, and it's also known as Rynek. And I'm probably the only person ever in the world that said, yay, that's a bird, and you're not supposed to be excited about that, but Rynek is the name of this bird because it often is tilting its head in a weird way, listening for things in the wood. It is a kind of woodpecker, but a really weird woodpecker. It doesn't have the same kind of tail as a regular woodpecker does. It doesn't have the hard, stiff tail feathers. But the other thing is that people way back thought that this bird was magic, and it sometimes was thought to be bad luck, and it could cause you problems if you saw or dealt with the wryneck. And if you know that scientific names have, there's two Latin or often Greek names together, like Homo sapiens for people, the genus, the first word of this bird's name is jinx. So if you've been jinxed or something is a jinx, it all goes back to the wryneck, this magical bird that some people were afraid of. And it's a woodpecker. It's an ancient woodpecker. And here's the more typical kind of woodpecker we have here, a Downy Woodpecker, and I'll talk about that later. They have this crazy set of adaptations to their lifestyle. So they're banging away at these trees, and they have, first of all, a chisel for a beak. If you look very close, you'll see that the tip of the beak, the bill, is like a chisel, very sharp. And then also you'll see these lines that come in towards the bill, and these are structural features to make this really, really hard feature. So their bills are super hard. They also have all of these hairy feathers that cover the nostril, because if you're poking your bill at high speed into the trees, you don't want anything to get into your nose. So they have a lot of things going on. And also, once they make those big holes, they need the tongue to go in and actually grab the food. Their tongues are super long, and they have all of these little spikes at the tip that will impale the beetle larvae and then bring it back to the beak to eat. So their tongues actually wrap around their skull, so they can bring a huge long tongue out when they need to, and it's all wrapped around the skull. And they also serve to cushion the head. And in fact, if you look at all of the different bits that the woodpecker has on the head to keep it safe while it's banging away, you can sort of sort them out to a couple to about 3 or 4 elements. But this I got from a scientific magazine, that here it says that they can drum as fast as 22 beats per second, right? So it's a lot of force that's going in to pecking a hole. And they also have, while their brain case is right there in the head, of course, they have to cushion the brain so they don't get hurt. The tongue partially is an elastic layer that grips onto the head and helps cushion, right? They also have spongy bone. The bone itself is soft and spongy, and sometimes sort of bends in the right way in this purple area here to take the stress of the banging. The bill is super hard, and then the skull has a little liquid layer between the brain and the skull, so that the brain is actually never really hitting the inside of the skull. So all of these things go to make a woodpecker's head. And interestingly enough, engineers have used all of these different things to create a shock absorber for electronics, such as a black box in an airplane, that you need to have it, be safe after it's been through something major. And woodpeckers were how we learned to do that. They also have, all birds have this third eyelid. If you see this Downy woodpecker here, there's like a funny third eyelid. It comes in from the front to the back. And theirs tends to be very strong, really thick, because if they're pecking, each time they peck, their third eyelid is brought into use. So you can see the same bird here. No, you don't see any eyelid coming in, and then that one on the right, it actually shows you that funny gray look, and it comes in as a third eyelid nictitating membrane is what they call it. Habitat. So the best habitat for woodpeckers tends to be good forest, either coniferous forest or deciduous forest. Oaks, they all are important for woodpeckers, and in general, trees are the key. right? So if we look at, this is eBird data. eBird, if you don't know eBird, go and sign up ebird.org and start whatever you're seeing in your backyard, start putting the data in there and get involved in the backyard bird count and so forth. eBird is a really fantastic set of data gathered by the public, and it is now the biggest data set of any biological data set on Earth. So it's massive. People are using it all over the world. Right now, somebody's using eBird. But this is the map of pileated woodpeckers and, you know, San Mateo, Santa Clara County. And you'll see that they're not right at the coast. They're not really on the bay side. They're not in the urban areas. They're really in the hills, mountains, in the forest. And then it maps so well to some of the habitat that, you know, county parks and mid-peninsula open space are preserving. So there's a real correlation between habitat and woodpeckers. Right in there, you can see it, and Corinne will probably talk more in detail about that. This is my humble backyard in Half Moon Bay. Not the best place for woodpeckers. I've seen a lot of different birds here, but it just doesn't have enough trees for it to be a really good woodpecker place. But even so, I have seen woodpeckers. They do come around every so often, and they'll peck even at a small tree. Downy woodpecker is the one that tends to come around for small trees. It is a smaller woodpecker, so it'll take side branches and not just the big trunks. Downy woodpecker is common throughout the Bay Area. It's a little black and white bird with a beak that just looks small for its size, the beak. And then all of the black and white on the wings, you'll see, and there's a lot of black and white on the head. A lot of woodpeckers are black and white. When they have red in the nape here, that's a male. When they don't have a red, it's a female. So watch for this one in your backyards, because it can be one of the most common, or at least the most widespread, if you're talking about the Bay Area. This is a female on the left here, and this shows another feature of downy woodpeckers. Downy and hairy woodpeckers have a white stripe on the back. And look at this one. This one has red on the crown. Now, you go back, the male has red on the nape, the back of the head. Female has no red. So what's weird is that this is the youngster. This is the juvenile that has this red on the top of the head, not on the back of the head. Why I say this is weird is that in most birds, when there's sort of a bright coloration, that an adult, one of the, either the male or the female has that bright coloration and the other sex doesn't have it, the youngsters usually look like the sex that doesn't have that bright coloration. Woodpeckers are unusual in that they have this red as youngsters. So that's odd. And it's in a different place in the male. It's on the top of the head. And the other thing that's odd is both male and female juveniles have the red on top of the head. So you, as a downy woodpecker, will start with red on the head if you're a female, and then it'll go away, and you'll have no red again for your rest of your life, like this bomb here on the left. And then the male, that red kind of shifts down to the back of the head. And it's really weird. And this shows up in a lot of woodpecker species, that the youngsters have a colorful patch that moves or disappears as they age. When woodpeckers fly, they do this funny thing where halfway through their flight, they'll flap their wings, they close up, just like this pileated here on the left from Donna Pomeroy's photograph. And when they close up, they start falling, and then they open up the wings again, do a couple of flaps, and then they go up, and then they go down, and they go up, and they go down. They look like they're on a roller coaster, and it's a really specific flight style that shows up once you learn it. The downy woodpeckers do it. Most woodpeckers do this up and down flight that we call undulating flight. Right here, this downy woodpecker on the right shows you the outer tail feathers are white, but they have all of this black spotting, and I'll tell you why that's important in a second. The other backyard woodpecker that's quite common, but only on the bay side for San Mateo County. On the coast, we don't see this. It's on the bay side, and then throughout, Santa Clara County and so forth, and the East Bay, is Nettles Woodpecker. And Nettles Woodpecker is a little bigger than the downy, But if you look, they don't have the white back stripe. They have like a zebra stripe, black and white, all up the back. It's a little different. And also look at the fact that their face is a dark mask that's completely encircled in white. Just let's see if I can show you how different this is here. The Downies, the mask connects. It doesn't have white on the back. So the white is different on the back and it's different on the head. So that's key for Nettles Woodpecker. And then if you get into sounds and so forth, there's ways to identify these birds on sound. I should just mention that the one without the red here is the female and the one with the red here is the male. And look at that spottiness on the crown, it's kind of funny. Nettles Woodpeckers really like oak habitats. They are originally an oak species that has done very well in suburban habitats as well. So they will be in backyards, as I said. But if you look at their complete world range, that purple, it is almost all in California. It just sort of, it gets just into Oregon and just into Baja California and Mexico. And otherwise, this is a specialist bird of our California oak forests and savannas. Oaks are very important in California, and they've created habitats that are unique, and many creatures, plants, and birds are only found in these oaks. Jays and magpies in particular are really dependent on oaks and acorns. And yellow-billed magpie, in fact, this one that you find south, Santa Clara County and, further in the East Bay rather than in San Mateo County, they are a species that is only found in California. Only found in California. Then the scrub jay does range north and south of California, but it does have the name California scrub jay because most of its range is in California. Again, these oaks are really important. This is a less common species that's found in taller forests, bigger forests, riparian, which means right along creeks. So they can be in a backyard, but they're not as widespread as the downy or the Nettles, and it's hairy woodpecker. Hairy woodpecker is almost exactly like the downy. The colors are the same, but they are bigger. They are bigger and they have a longer beak. So the bill looks like it's almost not quite the same size as the head, but it's almost there. Well, on a downy woodpecker, it would look sort of, just up to there. The other thing is, if you ever see the tail really well, the tail is all white on the sides without that black spotting I mentioned before in Donna's photograph of the flying hairy and downy woodpecker, or the flying downy woodpecker. But here's a photo from two individuals from the East Coast where they're a little bit more spotty than they are here, but the hairy is the big one on the left and the downies is the little one on the right. But look at the beak. And you can see the little spotting there on the sides of the tail of the downy, no spotting on the sides of the hairy. But otherwise, they look very much alike. And they can be a real trouble for a beginner birder. And, look for the tail, look for the bill size. And once you get real good at sounds, those really help too. But here's something really weird. When people look at the genetic relationships of woodpeckers, the hairy woodpecker is actually actually quite closely related to this beautiful woodpecker of the Sierra, the white-headed woodpecker. In fact, the two sound very much alike. So white-headed woodpecker and hairy woodpecker are closely related. And the suggestion is, well, that hairy and downy are actually not that closely related by all the genes and so forth. But the suggestion is that they might look alike, because there's an evolutionary kind of convergence on a type, on a look. And it could be that the smaller downy woodpecker is getting some benefit, by looking like the larger hairy woodpecker. It's a mimic. It's mimicking the hairy woodpecker's color. And this actually happens in multiple species of woodpeckers throughout the world. So there's ongoing research to try to figure out why unrelated, or at least not real closely related species of woodpeckers, a bigger one and a smaller one. It's always a big one and a small one, always look alike. So that's an open question. So if there's any kids who want to become scientists, you can tackle that question, figure it out, then we'll be happy to know what the answer is. And niche differences. The hairy and the downy, because they have different sizes, the downy can handle smaller trees, smaller twigs, and often they're on the side branches of the trees rather than on the main trunk. So you can see these little downy woodpeckers here perching on little twigs, and they will sometimes even forage on these little tiny twigs. And good view there of the spottiness of those outer tail feathers on the underside of the tail of the downy. Then if we get into areas with a lot of oaks and you have the acorn woodpecker, I got to tell you, acorn woodpeckers are really interesting, and you could do a multiple-hour talk just on acorn woodpeckers and what they do, how they live, how they breed. And I think I'll boil it down to this. Acorn woodpeckers are beautiful. They look like they have a clown face almost, with that white eye that's distinctive, and all this kind of creamy, buttery white on the face. They hide acorns in trees or posts that we call granaries. They hide them there in the fall to store them for the winter into the early spring for food. And it's a group of woodpeckers that hides them. It's a group of collaborative working woodpeckers that hide these things. And they will even, when the acorn shrinks a little bit and dries out, they have to move them to other places so that those darn squirrels don't get in there and get them. They defend these granaries from other acorn woodpeckers. Their nesting success next year depends on how well they did at collecting acorns. If there's a really bad year for acorns, these woodpeckers will leave. Sometimes they'll do this migration. They're usually resident. They usually don't leave, but every so often, every 10 years or so, there'll be this migration out of acorn woodpeckers when the acorn crop is very low. But they nest collaboratively, so one nest may have multiple breeding females and multiple breeding males. They will also have young acorn woodpeckers from the previous year or up to 2 or 3 years old that help at the nest. So they're often related to the chicks in the nest. They're like their brothers or sisters. And all of this is very well studied in California. And there's a lot more complexity to it. All sorts of evolution of females will peck at eggs to break them. And there's reasons why they do that, and to change, the probability that their egg does well in the nest rather than somebody else's eggs. The males don't always know who their offspring is and so forth, so they will feed all young and be very helpful around the nest. And there's a lot of stuff going on in acorn woodpeckers. So next time you see them, just go, wow, not only do you look interesting, you are interesting. Another woodpecker that really looks interesting, and this is one from the East Coast, but it's considered the same species as the northern flicker. The northern flicker comes in a yellow shafted form and a red shafted form. Sometimes this yellow shafted form shows up here in the winter, and they have red on the nape and black. The males have black here. The shafts are the shafts of the feathers. But when you just look at this bird, look at the colors, look at the spots, look at the gray, this warmth, buffy color. It's just one of the most gorgeous birds you can ever imagine. And these birds live here. Flickers are special in that they often will forage on the ground, and they will eat ants, and will sometimes eat ground insects and use ants to clean their feathers. They will actually put ants on their feathers, and the ants release this acid, formic acid, that cleans out a lot of the other sort of bad stuff that's in there. It could be other insects or mites and so forth that they're trying to get rid of using the ants as a tool. But here's what the more standard local flicker looks like. It's the red shafted, and see here, Donna's photographs show us these orangey red shafts, feather shafts. That's where it gets its name. And the red shafted has a red mustache, no red on the nape, equally beautiful when you get into the details. The other woodpeckers that you can find here are the sap suckers. The only one that breeds in the Bay Area and in the Santa Cruz Mountains is the red-breasted sap sucker. Now, the reason they're called sap suckers is because they make these funny holes they're called wells, that will create a run of sap from the tree, so the sweet sap, and they will then eat insects attracted to the sap as well as the sap itself. This is the red-breasted sap sucker, and in some places, these sap wells are really important place for hummingbirds to feed on, and in particular in eastern North America, the sap sucker is an early migrant. It arrives in late March and into April. The hummingbirds arrive in late April, and if the flowers aren't quite out yet, if it's a late season, the sapsucker wells are there, and the ruby-throated hummingbird in the east sometimes depends on the sapsucker for food. Here are Anna's and Allen's hummingbirds. These Allen's are the more orangey ones, and they're arriving right now in the Bay Area. The Anna's is here all year round. They will sometimes forage at sapsucker wells as well. And there's this idea of woodpeckers in many ways, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this, provide habitat for other birds and other creatures. They're keystone species is what that's called. But I wanted to show you that although red-breasted sapsucker is the most regularly encountered one in the Bay Area, sometimes we do get these other ones. This is the yellow-bellied sapsucker, and this is the red-naped sapsucker. I won't go too much into details on this, except I just want you to see something that I find really interesting, and even a lot of birders who've been around, watching birds for a long time, often don't see this, and it's weird. I think it's really weird. But if you look at the yellow-bellied sapsucker, which is the most stripy one, they have this white stripe, and they have the black, and they have red on the crown, they have red on the throat. They have a real nice black throat patch. Then we go down to the red-naped, and the throat patch takes over that black stripe up here, right? And then we go to this red-breasted sapsucker, and you can see the stripe is still in there. The dark and the white stripe are in there, but it's being taken over by red. And then this one is a red-breasted sapsucker from the north, from British Columbia or Washington State. It's even more red on the head, and you can't almost see the stripe. It's almost all gone. That idea of having genes where the red takes over from black, like it masks it, it's almost as if it's laying on top of the black, is really unusual. So I imagine that the black actually is still under there, and it's the red that's taken over on the various species, and that's an unusual pattern. And it brings me back to that red on top of the head of that Downy Woodpecker. The juvenile red is very important and shows up in weird places on woodpeckers. And it often tells you your age, or tells you if you're male or female, or in this case, I don't know why it masks these, black and white bits, and you'd think the black and white bits would be important. Why is the red taking over? But there you go, a little bit about sapsuckers. And if you go a little further afield, go to the Sierras, you can sometimes see the Williamson sapsucker. It's rare here in the Bay Area. I'll just point it out in that it's the only other sapsucker that I haven't mentioned, and it's also found in California. The male is really, really bright. The female is this kind of barred brown and black barred thing. They were thought to be two different species originally. Scientists didn't realize that one was a female and one was the male. So that's happened in the past multiple times when you have, in the old days, in the 1800s, that male and females were thought to be two different species. In the Bay Area, and it's not common, but in oak savannas, in Santa Clara County or further out in the East Bay, or if you get down to a little further south in the Diablo Range, you can see the Lewis's woodpecker, named for Lewis of Lewis and Clark. And it is amazing. Like, if you look at this thing, it has pink on the belly, red on the face. And if you see over here on the right, it catches bugs in the air. They will often sit up on top of a dead oak and fly out, catch a bug, come back, and then sometimes will act like a normal woodpecker. Sometimes they'll even be on the ground. But when they fly, they don't do that undulation. They fly like a crow. So they just good and steady flight. So if you're wanting to see something different, go on eBird, look and see where people have been seeing Lewis's woodpeckers, and it's an amazing, amazing critter. Now, not everything that is on trees, on the bark, are woodpeckers. There are a couple other groups, the creepers and the nuthatches. This is a brown creeper here with a slim little bill, and they are brown, and they tend to go up the tree and peck at things in the bark. Nuthatches, like this white-breasted nuthatch, tend to go downwards on the tree and look for things in the bark. And this white-breasted nuthatch, you'll see their body shape is sort of wider at the front than in the back, and that's probably a way for them to balance really well as they're going down head first. So if you see a bird going down head first on a tree, it's a nuthatch. And I'll point out Sequoia, Audubon Society's logo is a Pygmy nuthatch. So it's not quite a woodpecker, but it's a Pygmy nuthatch. These woodpeckers, like this downy with the little bill, make holes to nest in. And these holes then they'll use for one season. Sometimes they'll make another hole to sleep in. And when they're not being used the next time around, other species use these holes, like this oak titmouse. So this is really important. The fact that they create cavities are being used by other birds later on, or sometimes even insects like bees, is really important. So much so that we found that some birds, bluebirds are a real good example, are limited in their population by the number of holes that are available in the environment. And due to this, some people have started putting out nest boxes to help bluebirds or sometimes swallows, or you can, in your backyard, chickadees will take a nest box. And make sure that if you are interested in putting up a nest box, if you don't have woodpeckers around to make holes for you, and even if you do, it's not a bad thing, that you buy the right size and hole size for the species you're looking to provide a nest for, okay? Because a lot of the little nest boxes that look cute often don't work. It's the ones that often look ugly are the ones that work. So keep that in mind. And there are various stores that sell this type of stuff here in the Bay Area, the Birder's Garden here in the peninsula, and also Los Gatos Birdwatcher down in South Bay, two great places to ask about nest boxes. This is a Chesapeake chickadee backyard bird that might use a nest box, and there's a surprising set of birds throughout the continent that use holes made by woodpeckers. Like this owl, this saw-whet owl, actually probably depends, a lot of the saw-whet owls depend on pileated woodpeckers for their holes. And further north, woodpeckers or the flicker create the holes big enough for the bufflehead, which is a duck. And there are wood ducks that need nest holes, and all sorts of other ducks, and chickadees, and there's multiple species that depend on woodpeckers for their health in terms of nesting. And we'll sort of end up a little bit on the sad note of fires. We've lost a lot of land. People have been displaced. There's been a lot of negative that's happened due to fires. But we also have to, as naturalists, open up our mind to the fact that fires change the habitat. Fires have always been here. Now, the number, the extent, the heat of these fires is not natural. That's a whole different conversation. But fire as a way for the environment to sort of replenish and move nutrients around is natural. And the fires that have happened now have created a lot of dead trees. These dead trees are amazing habitat for woodpeckers. And I would predict that one of the things that might happen is that pileated woodpeckers over time will become much more common due to these fires. And so some species get a benefit from fires in even the ones that depend on the forest itself. And pileated woodpeckers might be one of them. There is a woodpecker elsewhere in California, North America, that there's actually two species. This one's called the American three-toed woodpecker and the blackback woodpecker that are fire dependent in other parts of North America. And here we may also have a secondary set of birds that may then come in due to woodpecker holes or other aspects of the fire. And one of them is the Vox's swift. We may see increases in Vox's swifts due to the habitat changes that have happened due to fires. And this is a species of conservation concern somewhat. They've lost a lot of their population. So it's interesting that we might have some benefits. But I'll just end up saying that we named this a wonderful world of woodpeckers. And I've just been talking to you about this little slice of the world, which is where we live. When you expand to other parts of the earth, there are amazing woodpeckers. This little thing here is a little tiny woodpecker called a chestnut piculate. This one on here is another little one that looks like the downy, but it's even smaller, is the Japanese Pygmy woodpecker. This guy is a huge woodpecker from Patagonia, which has this kind of little Richard haircut. Up there is the Magellanic Woodpecker, and then the yellow fronted woodpecker from South America is one of the most beautiful. And believe it or not, its close relative from Colombia is actually called the beautiful woodpecker. It's an official name. So with that, I want to thank everybody who's been involved in putting this together, and also really want to thank Donna Pomeroy for her wonderful photographs that helped to illustrate this talk. That was really helpful. It made it possible. And as far as what I'm up to, if you please go to alvarosadventures.com, and if you're interested in workshops, there's a little area there that says events, and we're having owls workshop, and with the bird observatory, a birdsong workshop. Next week, owls is the week after, and in July we'll start doing the boat trips to the Farallones and so forth. So please, if you're interested in going out on a trip, you know where to find me, alvarosadventures.com. And I will stop there, and we will chat with Corinne, I think.
Great. Thank you so much, Alvaro, for your presentation. It's so much very valuable information about woodpeckers, and really fascinating. I'm just going to do a short share about where you can find some woodpeckers in San Mateo County Parks, and Corinne's going to do the same for Mid-Peninsula Region Open Space Preserves. So I'm going to share my screen now, and there's two really great places to look. There's a lot of great places to look. eBird, it was mentioned as a good place to look for bird sightings. The birding guide on the Sequoia Audubon Society website is also a great guide to look at. You can look for a specific species, like the Pileated Woodpecker, and then you can see where sightings have been for that bird. So for this bird in particular, there has been a sighting at San Pedro Valley Park. I know that was a question in the chat. There's been a sightings in Memorial Park, Pescadero Creek County Park, and Sam McDonald, Wonder Lake, Huddart. And just yesterday, Jennifer Ryzenke, myself, and Lily went out, and we heard a Pileated Woodpecker at Wonder Lake County Park. So they are there. You can also check out iNaturalist. iNaturalist has a great guide for the birds of San Mateo County, and I want to shout out to Donna Pomeroy for putting this together as well. So you can click on the types of birds that you're interested in finding more information about. So in this case, I clicked on woodpeckers, and it shows the 7 species of woodpeckers found in the county. And you can click on the species you're interested in. So I clicked on the Pileated, and it shows me this map of observations that have been made through iNaturalist. So those are some good spots to look for observations. Many of these birds or all these birds are found in our parks, and I won't go through each individual species, but I'm going to pass it on to Corinne now from Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District to share where you can find these birds in for their parks and preserves.
Great, thank you, Catherine and Al. Let me transition over here and share my screen. Let me know if you can see this.
Yes, we can see it.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Corinne Tokatlian. I'm a biologist with the Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District. And thank you, Al, for that wonderful talk, and Catherine for your information about county parks. I just wanted to also share a little bit of information and woodpecker information specific to our district preserves. So if you're not familiar with us, we are an open space district. We were established in 1972. We own and manage 26 open space preserves throughout the San Mateo, Santa Cruz, and Santa Clara counties. And one of our primary missions is to conserve the natural resources that are found within those open spaces that we own. So we try to manage our habitats as naturally as possible while also balancing public access and recreation opportunities with a very, very light footprint. So the picture that you see on the screen here is kind of a typical view that you might find in one of our open spaces throughout the peninsula. Many of our open space preserves are along what we call like the Skyline Core, the Skyline Ridge or Skyline Boulevard running north-south through the peninsula. And I've just very creatively pointed out some of our preserves in this area with these yellow arrows. The northernmost arrow is pointing out our Purisima Creek Redwoods Open Space Preserve. And then moving south, we have our El Corte de Madera, La Honda, Russian Ridge, Skyline Ridge, sort of Montebello Junction, and then the furthest southern arrow is our El Sereno Open Space Preserve. So these are just a few of our open space preserves, and this is a map from eBird that Al had also shown a different version of. So this is just a little bit more zoomed into this particular arrow, and this map is showing pileated woodpecker observations from eBird. So you can really, I really just wanted to show how pileated woodpecker observations in particular are correlated with our district preserves. It's also interesting to note a few hotspots throughout the area, including the area circled in yellow here on the map. This is our Skyline Ridge, Russian Ridge, Montebello, Los Trencos sort of junction. So we can really see there are quite a few observations in that area of pileated woodpecker. Our open spaces are available for everyone, and for many of us, they're in our own backyards. So I really just encourage everyone to explore the hundreds of miles of trails that are available for hiking, biking, and equestrian use. These are really great opportunities for bird watching and looking for woodpecker sign that Al shared with us throughout this talk. And many of the preserves that are seen on this map have very established woodland, both deciduous and coniferous woodland forested habitats and oak woodland forested habitats that are prime habitat for many of the woodpecker species that Al discussed before. So I'm glad that Al showed his map, and I can show this map as well. And I also just wanted to share a few anecdotes about woodpeckers from us at the district. These are photos taken by one of our staff biologists. He lives in the area that was circled in yellow on the previous map, and he shared the photo on the left of a pileated woodpecker that was actually just taken just outside his window. So observations of pileated woodpeckers are pretty common in the forests along Skyline Boulevard, as you can see on that map. The photo on the right is of a pileated woodpecker observed in our Purisima Creek Redwoods Open Space Preserve, and it was observed in sort of the what we call the Purisima uplands. And this observation was sort of interesting because the area where this bird was observed is more sort of open, scrubby grassland type of habitat, not the typical woodland habitat that you would think of finding this bird. But there are sort of small pockets of Douglas fir and pine that this bird was seen like hopping in between, going to and from those little patches of forested areas. So it's just sort of an interesting observation. And as Al mentioned previously, you know, there are these typical habitats where we find woodpeckers, but, you know, we can see them in other places as well, perhaps if they're, you know, foraging or kind of looking for different forage opportunities, or perhaps just a change of scenery. I've also encountered pileated woodpeckers during my marbled murrelet surveys in the El Corte de Madera Preserve. So these are really early morning surveys where I'm just standing in the middle of a forest listening for marbled murrelet cure calls. The photo here is just a location of one of my survey spots, and the arrow is pointing at one of the old growth redwood trees that I was focused on. And this is just a photo looking straight up into the canopy. And And while, you know, just very quietly listening to all of the forest birds waking up in the morning, suddenly I heard this distinctive pileated woodpecker's loud drumming sound that came just resonating from the forest next to me. So it was just a really great reminder of the variety of birds and the variety of woodpeckers, including the pileated, that are occupying these open spaces. On another occasion, I heard that same drumming, that booming drumming sound that came from the canopy of a large Douglas fir within a patch of old growth forest habitat on the Resolution Trail. So again, I encourage all of you to explore our preserves if you haven't already, in particular Elcorte de Madera on some of these trails that are listed on the screen. And while you're recreating, take a moment to pause in the forest to look and to listen for woodpecker signs along the way. I don't know if this video is going to work, but I'll give it a try. This was a video taken of a pileated woodpecker in our Elcorte de Madera preserve on the Blue Blossom Trail. So again, just good footage and a good opportunity to see one of these species of interest that we're talking about today. And I also wanted to briefly mention that Al talked a little bit about acorn woodpeckers and their fascinating lifestyle and the importance of granary trees for them. So we are aware of several granary trees in our district preserves. We have quite a few in our Bear Creek Redwoods open space preserve near Lexington Reservoir. And again, there's a granary tree in our Rancho San Antonio open space preserve that's actually in a really easily accessible spot. If you're familiar with that area, it's just before you reach the junction to Deer Hollow Farm. And then the photo on the right is a granary tree actually in an old growth redwood in Elcorte de Madera again, and this is on the South Leaf Trail. So it's a little difficult to see the acorn holes from this photo, but if you go visit this grove, it's a really peaceful site. You can sort of listen to the acorn woodpeckers wake up in the morning, squawking around up in the canopy, and you can see, you know, acorn sign on the ground below you. So I encourage you to come and visit the site as well. So I'll just close out quickly. Mature growth trees, standing dead snags, natural cavities, woodpecker cavities, and fallen logs. These are all important habitat elements. They provide food and habitat for many different species, including several woodpeckers, as Al described to us. Some land managers remove these elements from the landscape because they're considered, you know, unsightly or a fire or a fall risk. But we at the district know that these elements are important for the land's natural function. Therefore, we do our best always to preserve these habitats, deciduous and coniferous habitats, by acquiring those properties and maintaining them in their natural state to support these native wildlife. We always try to retain dead snags and fallen logs whenever possible. We try not to clean any of that natural litter on the landscape. And we also, sometimes there are specific opportunities where we can provide habitat enhancements. So Al actually a few years ago actually helped us discover an area where purple martins, a somewhat rare swallow species in our region, are using cavities that were created by northern flickers, which is another type of woodpecker that Al described to us. So in order to support the purple martins, we actually installed poles with pre-made cavities to mimic that sort of natural habitat that woodpeckers were creating. So we try, at the district, we try not to install too many nest boxes because we're emphasizing trying to maintain that natural habitat. But again, we're always trying to look for to protect our natural resources and support them sometimes in creative ways as well. So with that, I'll just hand it back over to Catherine and Al and just say thank you for your time and good luck and have fun exploring our trails and looking for woodpeckers.
Great, thank you, Corinne, for your update about Mid-Penn preserves and where you can find these wonderful woodpecker species. So we have a few questions that we're going to go over now. I know that we've reached the 11 o'clock point, so if you have to leave, please go ahead, and thank you so much for joining us. And we hope to see you in our parks and preserves sometime soon. We're going to start with our first questions though. So I had kind of a menagerie of questions related to granaries for the acorn woodpecker. So I was going to lump those together. So a couple of people are wondering if acorn woodpeckers store acorns to raise bugs in the acorns or to eat the acorns themselves.
Oh, it's the acorn itself that they're eating. Yeah, there's a lot of nutrition in there, and you know, First Nations peoples here too ate acorns, and so you know, it's good food. I will say though that when acorn woodpeckers or these jays are feeding young, they tend to feed them insects. They need to have that protein, and you know, but as the acorn woodpeckers get a little bit bigger in the nest, they start feeding them little bits of acorn, get them used to their future lifestyle.
Great. And so another question related to granaries was that you mentioned that squirrels may steal food from the granaries. Do other bird species do the same?
The woodpeckers are pretty good at defending. So because they have a good group of individuals, they can defend either, you know, from squirrels. And if a jay came in there trying to steal the acorns, I think they would probably drive them away. But the scrub jays or Steller's jays might actually try to steal the acorns. The jays themselves, I showed a picture of a California scrub jay. That individual was actually hiding an oak, you know, an acorn as well, but they usually do it in the ground. So they will poke them into the ground. So they are also storing acorns, just in a different way.
Great. And then one more question about granaries right now is, does the acorn granary contain one acorn per small hole, or is the cavity inside the tree with an acorn-sized entrance hole and has multiple acorns back to back in it?
It usually is one hole, one acorn, because that way they can extract the acorn. But sometimes, you know, if it's like if it falls through the back, you can get situations where there's all these acorns in the back that are not accessible to the woodpeckers. But it's usually one hole, one acorn, and there's hundreds of holes.
Great. And actually one more question just came in about granaries. Let's see, after a fire, would acorns in the granary tree still be edible, or would the granary tree acorns be lost?
Oh, that's a good question. My thought is that many of them probably won't be edible. Just, you know, if they're, you know, but it made me hungry for eating chestnuts though, suddenly. Just grilled chestnut would be great. But yeah, no, I think it's the level of heat that they have. If they've just been, if there's a bit of heat on them, that's okay. But if they burnt, I don't think they're viable anymore as food.
Cool. We had another question. Can you say more about distinguishing between woodpeckers by call and or drumming sounds?
Yeah, I didn't get into calls too much because, you know, it was already a lot of things to talk about in the time. But yes, you can actually distinguish woodpeckers by their call. There's some of them that are similar. The flicker can sometimes sound like a pileated woodpecker if you have to compare the sounds, but it's, you know, they're these very loud kind of quack, 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 you know, to resonate through the forest. The smaller downy and hairy woodpeckers can be separated by sound. You know, the hairy has a sharper note than the downy, and the downy will have this little trilled vocalization. I mean, I'm not going to make all the noises, but yes, one thing I would mention though is that the sap suckers, the red-breasted, red-naped, and yellow-bellied sound very much alike. So you have to see them to know which species it is, and they're actually very much a stealthy woodpecker. They will hide. They will be very quiet, and when people come around, they go to the other side of the tree trunk, and they will. I think they're much more common than any of us think they are, but they're really quiet. And when they start making noise, it's a very nasal kind of note, kind of like a sort of a cat-like nasal note. And once you learn that, you can actually find some of these sap suckers out in the field, especially in the winter when we have more sap suckers than in the summer. With the drumming, again, you can separate them. Some of them are hard, and loudness is not necessarily important, because how loud the drum sound is depends on if they found a really resonant part, piece of wood. So a little Downy woodpecker can sound very loud. So the volume is not as important as the pattern, how fast it is. And sap suckers, for example, will have they will slow down, so they do kind of a tick, 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 while the other guys might just go like. So, but it takes a lot of learning. I must admit, I got to invest more time in my drumming, and that's all done with the bill on the wood, right? They're not making that sound vocally.
I just want to add for the new birders in the group that one fast way to learn these sounds is that there's a number of good apps for your smartphone. This includes one that is that's sponsored by David Sibley. It includes one called iBird, and all of these have a range of sounds on them. The other way, which I put in answer to a question earlier, is that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is one of the premier academic outfits in the study of birds in the United States, they have been maintaining audio and visual files on birds since the 1920s. In other words, since it became possible to do so. This repository is called the Macaulay Library, and they have decided to put all of the resources of the Macaulay Library online as open source for people to use. So it's all out there. It can be a confusing, almost like a tidal wave of sounds that you get when you go to the Macaulay Library. But if you're really interested in drilling down deep, shall we say, to stick with the woodpecker theme, the Macaulay Library will give you every sound you've ever wanted for these woodpeckers. Again, if you're just a beginner, really the apps are a better way. They're going to give you, like a good field guide. They give you a pretty general sense of what those birds sound like.
I'll also point out, like, if anybody can see this, there's a book called the Peterson, or you probably can't see it, Woodpeckers by Stephen Shunk. It's not a field guide, so if you wanted to go beyond the field guide and just have a reference book that has behavior, nesting, and all sorts of things, Steve's book on woodpeckers is really good. So it's the Peterson Woodpeckers of North America reference guide. And Stephen used to live in San Mateo County. He might have even grown up here for all, I think. So he's a local boy, but he lives now in Oregon.
Great. I have another question. Are dead trees better for woodpeckers because of beetles and drier wood? What about telephone poles? And do they harm or help a live tree, for example, by removing beetles?
Those are actually real complicated questions in some respects. Like there are certain foods that are available sometimes in abundance in dead trees for a woodpecker. If once the wood is a little bit more rotten, and then they're really kind of lots of beetles in there. There's different. It's not just where the amount of food, but if it's accessible, if it's not really deep in the wood and so forth. So there's a lot of different factors. Usually woodpeckers will try, if they can, or if it's possible, to make a nest in a live tree rather than the dead tree. Flickers are a little different. They'll make nests in dead trees. It's not a rule, but I think that there's probably elements of a live tree is less likely to blow over in the wind. There's probably a stronger sort of wood, around the nest in a live tree. And it's whether it helps the tree or not. I imagine that it's a hard thing to study, because you'd have to sort of exclude woodpeckers from an entire part of the forest to know what the role of woodpeckers actually is and isn't. I don't know if anybody's done that actually to do a true experiment. But very complicated questions, but good questions.
We had a follow-up question that's asked what their nests look like, and since you had mentioned that in that last answer, I just wanted to ask that then.
Yeah, nice circle, and then they're actually quite deep sometimes. And I did notice somebody mentioned in a good time to look for woodpeckers and pileated was when they're nesting, right? When the young are in the nest. Woodpeckers are very loud at the nest because it's so protected. They don't have this stealth type of behavior that a lot of birds have around nests. So they will fly right into a nest. And when the chicks are older, they're super noisy and they stick their head out of the nest and, make a real commotion. And so listen for something loud up in the trees in that midsummer period when things are nesting. That's a good way to look for woodpeckers in general and pileated too.
Great. There's another interesting question. We observed possible tool use by a Williamson Sap Sucker on a Jeffrey pine in 2013. To your knowledge, are there any other such observations?
No, actually, I haven't heard of that, but I mean, smart woodpeckers that, before you know it, they'll be using computers and they'll take over the world. But I will say, though, that there are birds that aren't woodpeckers elsewhere in the world, often islands. There's many islands that don't have woodpeckers, where a bird that's not a woodpecker takes over the woodpecker role. And one of them in the Galapagos is a finch called the woodpecker finch. And the woodpecker finch doesn't have the full bill of a woodpecker, and it can't get in deep to some of these holes that where the bugs are. And it actually will break off a twig and will poke the bug with the twig, bring it out, and then eat it. So there's tool use in a bird called woodpecker that isn't a woodpecker. So I'm kind of thinking that you could see why woodpeckers would do this. If they can't reach that specific bit of food, they might be, if you're, enterprising woodpecker, might figure this out somehow. But I've never heard of it. I don't know if anybody else has in the panel. It's cool.
We had a question that was, we'll do like maybe 2 more questions and then we'll finish up because we're getting a little bit over time here. And so one more question that we had was, I saw a bit of creamy yellow around the beaks of Nettle, Hairy, and Downy woodpeckers in the photos. I sometimes don't see that on them when I'm out birding. Is that just a variation, or is the creamy yellow around the beak from hammering against the wood?
I actually think I think that some of those bristles that start out white, if they're working on wood that is moist or has any element that could stain the white, they get a little yellow. But I've noticed that too. I don't think they start out yellow. I think those bits start out white, and it's staining almost the same way that if you look at swans or snow geese, Ross's geese in the Central Valley, they'll get this beautiful golden staining from the mud. So it's it's staining from the wood, I think, probably moist wood.
Great. The next question is, growing up in the Santa Cruz Mountains bioregion from mid-1950s, my family was sorrowful that pileated woodpeckers had been extirpated. My mom used to say, someday they'll be back. My first knowledge of return is late 1980s and early 1990s. Now I am fortunate to see them including on and over their land. So where did they return from? I've pondered the Santa Lucias, but I have no knowledge to support that. And then they made a comment, my mom was a Latin scholar and pronounced it pileated. Thank you.
Yeah, I've often thought, if birders could have a meeting with the Pope, it would be all about pronunciation of all these Latin names, because these Latin scholars. And Jennifer, who's a religious scholar, is probably thinking, yes, indeed. That's great. That's a really amazing story, that the woodpeckers, were extirpated for a while and they came back, and they really are coming back nicely. Their population's growing since I've lived here. It used to be sort of like, wow, it's really rare, and now they're around. Now, come from is a really good question, but I'll say this: every so often, A pileated woodpecker is seen in the most unusual place, and a birder will happen to be driving by somewhere in, you know, the lowlands in by the bay or San Francisco, and a pileated woodpecker will go flying by. And although there's real forest birds, they do have an ability to disperse long distances that is not well understood, I would say. So they might have come from Marin. They might have crossed from the north. I don't know if they could have also come from the south. It's an open question, and I don't think we would be able to know for sure, because even if you use genetics or some, you know, these are all part of the same genetic population, either south or north or east of us. So we probably would have to guess really at this point, but they do disperse. They will be seen sometimes, you know, in the oddest places, you know. So if you are, you know, on, you know, waiting for your Starbucks, you know, in the lineup in your car, and a big black and white woodpecker goes by, and you think, well, there's no way it's a pileated woodpecker. Actually, it could be. So, you know, keep your eyes open.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alvaro, for sharing your extensive knowledge about woodpeckers and birds in general. We're so thankful for everyone for joining us today for this webinar. And once again, you've been watching the wonderful World of Woodpeckers presented by Alvaro and San Mateo County Parks and Sequoia Audubon Society and Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District. So thank you for joining us today. And we did have some questions that didn't get answered, so I will pass those on to Alvaro if he wants to answer those offline, and maybe we can post them somewhere for everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend and wonderful birding, and we'll join in the Great Backyard Bird Count next weekend. All right, did anyone else want to share anything before we end today?
Just thank you to everybody who organized, all the organizations, all the work that these organizations have done for years to make it possible for people like myself to enjoy these wonderful areas and these birds. So thank you all, and thank you for watching and being supporters of all of the organizations listed.
And I would just add, get out next weekend from the 12th through the 15th for the Great Backyard Bird Count, and record your sightings on eBird and on iNaturalist, but eBird is where the Cornell will be looking at it. And let's see if we can document all 7 of our regular species in San Mateo County, and maybe get the 2 special ones out on the coast right now, the red-naped sapsucker and the yellow-bellied sapsucker. And if you can get pictures of them, all the better. Follow on our website and on the Peninsula Birding email list, if you're a member of that, for more information on how you can participate. Thank you, everyone.